Did you know that the term landlord comes from medieval times when all of the lords owned all of the land? Who knew, right? Leasehold is this crazy thing that we have in the UK that has existed for many, many years. It's a very outdated system. It's typically used in a lot of flats, but some of the new build house builders have tried to con a lot of people in the UK and actually sell houses, detached houses, on leasehold land. And in this video, we're going to explore the crazy world of leasehold property, where it came from and how it all started, and why it's really annoying in 2021. So let's jump in and explore this fascinating world of leasehold property. Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, my name's Matt. I work for a bank by day, I invest in property on the side, and on this channel we explore all things money, finance and property investing to help people lead a more financially savvy life. What is leasehold land? Well, it means that you only own the property on the land for a fixed amount of time, and that is the length of the lease that you have. This is different to having the freehold, and having the freehold means that you own the land and the property on the land. So when you're a leasehold property owner, it means that you have an agreement with the landlord or the freeholder to have that property and the land for a certain amount of time in your ownership, but you don't ultimately own it. And then when the lease ends, which they never really do because people renew them, it means then that the land and the property is transferred back into the name of the freeholder and the ultimate owner of that land and property. Obviously in 2021 that doesn't really happen. Leases don't expire down to the year zero, and they're often renewed around 80 years. That's considered the point when it's a short lease and starts to devalue a property. And commonly, leasehold is typical in flats and apartment buildings where you don't really own the land, but you can own and occupy that space that the flat sits within in the building, whether that's the ground floor or the top floor. It also means that if you are a leaseholder, you'll be subjected to things like ground rent, which is an annual or monthly payment to rent the ground from the freeholder, which is a bit of a con if you ask me. It also means that if you're in an apartment block or a flat, there are also going to be things like service charges and maintenance fees to pay for things like the communal areas, the lift if you have one, any garden spaces and maintenance of them, and that's how all of the costs start to add up when you buy a flat. There is a huge controversy around it though, because a lot of companies have tried to extort innocent people who are living in their first homes. It's really bad from the new builders, and investigations have taken part in the government and externally around the practice of leasehold, because people are being conned out of thousands of pounds. They're having service charges hiked up really, really high, because you've got profit-making companies trying to extort money out of innocent homeowners who are trying to get on the property ladder. Since all of the controversy, things are starting to improve a little bit and starting to get better. It's going to take a bit more time, I think. If you're buying a new build flat these days, typically, and hopefully, the lease should be 999 years. This is known as a very long-term lease, and it's almost the same thing as freehold without really giving you the true freehold in the flat, because that's not strictly possible. On the opposite end of the spectrum, you shouldn't be buying a house or a flat that has a lease any shorter than 80 years. If it's anywhere around the 80-year mark, you should really think about purchasing it or not, because when it gets to around 80 years, lenders tend to not lend or give money for a mortgage against that particular flat, and the valuation starts to go down because you have a potentially costly £20,000 or £40,000 lease renewal to bring that lease back up to the full standard, whether that's 150 years or 999 years. You could also consider buying the entire freehold as well, which is going to cost more money, but kind of increases the price of a property. There's a lot of research in the UK where a lot of estate agents and analysts believe that the difference between freehold and leasehold, as long as there's enough years on the leasehold, the difference is only about 5% in the price of a property. So factor that into the numbers and whether it's really worth it in the grand scheme of things. So let's dive into the history of leasehold and find out where this crazy, silly thing came from and how it all started. So going back to the past and all the way back to medieval times, owning land was a principle of social order and maintaining a social status. Typically, lords owned the vast amounts of land in the UK, and they were distributed between very few lords that existed at that time. This meant that it was very, very hard for the average working class family to actually have a home or own their own property in the UK. The most powerful families in the UK wanted to retain as much of their wealth as possible because they were greedy. But they didn't want to give away the land or sell it because then their wealth would be less. So instead what they did was come up with a system to rent the land to normal working class people and farmers, where they could pay to live on the land and have their homes on that specific area. And this is where the term peppercorn ground rent comes from. Now this is when a ground rent is very, very, very small. In 2021 you might only pay £1 for a single year on ground rent. And the reason why this happens, you might ask, Matt, what's the point in paying £1 for ground rent? Well, the reason is that the working class families were very poor back in medieval times compared to the lords of the UK. Now, they didn't have enough money to pay the lords or anything that was substantial or that the lords were interested in. So instead, they then exchanged a peppercorn to live on their land. So it wasn't really about collecting loads of rent from working class families, it was just about retaining the land and having that wealth and keeping it. The reason why they had to then collect a peppercorn in exchange for sitting on the land and renting it was because there was a legally binding contract and something had to be exchanged. Now, all the lords felt that the amount of money wasn't worth going out and collecting on a regular basis for their time and effort. That's why they did the peppercorn. Something was exchanged, and then there's a legally binding contract. That being said, peppercorn was a luxury spice back in medieval times, so that was considered quite a commodity compared to then collecting a few, or equivalent of a few pennies today. Over time, ground rents became even more crazy, including a crab, a single rose, a bouquet of flowers every single year, and even one apple. This is what people used to pay to have a house on the Lord's land. And the key behind all of this was making sure that the freeholders had control of the land at all times, and that the leaseholder couldn't then claim right of possession on the land after living there for so many years, because this formal exchange and contract has been in place. Therefore, they couldn't claim the ownership of the land because they'd been there for many, many years. As we start to go into more modern times, around the 1800s, this is where the leasehold system started to become a bit more modernised, and what was happening is that the freeholders were renting out their land on a lease for around 100 to 125 years, and they would get a fixed payment every single year for doing that as a part of their contract. The great thing here is that the landowners took away the risk from themselves because they weren't building the homes and going through the construction. They were simply renting out the land, and then it was up to the individuals to build homes in the UK, and they took on the risk of that construction project. And then as we start to get around the 1900s and up to the post-war era, this is where we started to build thousands and thousands of flats in the UK, where you have a big building that can't be owned by one single individual person who lives in one of the flats. Instead, you have the freeholder who owns the building, they maintain and manage the building, and each individual person who lives in each flat is then a leaseholder of their own space that they occupy within the building. Because freehold properties require horizontal division and borders to mark the land, this is why leasehold became very popular for flats, because it worked really well for the setup. And then as we come to today, leasehold is still used and a very popular thing. It has been abused a little bit more, so it's fine and it's a fantastic thing to do if you live in a flat or apartment building where leasehold makes complete sense and you have all those charges. Typically the ground rent is next to nothing, and instead you just pay the service charges and maintenance fees for the building. But recently a lot of the house builders have been creating these detached homes that can be divided horizontally and have set boundaries, but instead Taylor Wimpey and other large companies have been trying to maintain the freehold of the properties and then charge people increasing ground rents every single year. It was a massive con, a big scam, and the government have really stepped in to solve this problem and make it illegal for house builders to do this, because it was purely for greed and profit. But through all of this reform and constant chatter within the government, there are a lot of discussions around the theory that leasehold is slowly coming to an end, and eventually people will be able to own their own home as freehold all of the time. Scotland is already abolishing leasehold property and instead creating something called a common hold. So when you live in a flat apartment building, each individual person living there has a share of the freehold relational to their flat and the share that they own. And then also in 2015, Scotland changed all of the long form leaseholds into a form of freehold ownership. Now, my lease on this flat is 999 years and could technically be classed as a freehold. But it means today in Scotland that very few flats are actually leasehold, and instead they either have a share of the common hold or they have this new converted long form leasehold, almost freehold type agreement. Ultimately, it feels like this could be something that's going to happen in England in the future, and I'm sure and would like to hope that we will get there with some better reform on leasehold properties. But there are a lot of landowners, there are a lot of private investors and landlords who would be impacted by this, so it's a huge piece of work that the government have to work through. Nobody truly knows what is going to happen to leasehold in the future, but I love the idea that every person can own their own land and property in the UK without having to pay ground rent on a leasehold agreement. It's a massive difference from the days where very few and select lords owned the majority and swaths of the UK land, compared to today where everybody has the opportunity to own their own piece of the UK and their own land with their own home if they work hard enough and have the money to pay for it. I hope you found this video useful. I've got loads of other great ones like this one on top here, which is my day in the life of a property investor, or you can check out this one on the bottom here, which is my experience of trying to bid and buy properties through an online auction. So feel free to choose one of these, and I'll see you on the other side.